I think this is we're at the hardcore of one of the issue here, as the conflict or the not between nationalism and the necessity of international collaboration in space. And on the one hand, I think this is very important that we're all aware that people, corporation, individuals everywhere in the world actually contributed to the overall space programs. But at the same time, I'm always a little bit worried when I hear everyone raising one's flag and saying, I want my satellite, I want my launch pad, I want my rocket, and so on and so forth, because it's an issue of independence and sovereignty. And I don't know how we can go further this question. And there is also the question of pollution. Sure, everybody wants his or her own satellite to monitor the Earth and bring back the data to the citizens. But are we going to clog really the orbits? Or do we try to go beyond this nationalism? And this is something which is heavily present. And was heavily present, this contradiction was heavily present in the Congress, and is also heavily present with us in the arts sector. How do we go in a dialectic mode to find another option?
I think that's a very valid question, and I think what Fabienne was presenting here in some ways was trying to bring together. I don't know how many of you attended the Space Congress, but there was this very interesting question to the heads of space panels, a trick question at the end. What color flag will you plant on the moon? So the head of the Indian Space Agency said white, it has all the colors. The Japanese, the Canadian, and ESA head, they all said, yeah, that sounds like the right color to have. And then Nelson, who heads NASA, said, hey, guess what? The stars and stripes are already on the moon, so this is not even a question that I need to answer. So I think that's a very psychologically a brilliant question to see. That's fantastic. I like that. I think that sums up what our friend here just said is currently even the American flag is white. It's all bleached now. So I think. But coming back to what you just said. You know, we have constellations like Sentinel that Europe has launched, which is an open constellation. So anybody can download imagery. For example, we in India have our constellations, but we still use something like Sentinel. And you were talking about open source software and Lula and hackathons. So I think this culture of open, sort of not just collaboration and using data, but also of working together across boundaries, I think it does happen. It's just that it's not in the forefront of things, but it is happening. Did you want to say anything about, I could clearly see that the open soft, Davis, did you want to add something? Go ahead. Yeah?
So I also wanted to respond just to one of the comments that, that the lady made around ideas of sovereignty and space debris, which is, I think that we need to be careful when we kind of structure these questions, knowing what the existing power dynamics look like globally. So, firstly, 5 days ago, SpaceX just launched 54 Starlink satellites. In total, Africa has launched 48 satellites. So, Africa can quadruple the number of satellites that they have in space, and they won't even come close to what a single corporation is putting up there. So I think, the question of space debris is very real, but I think we need to be careful about where is the problem when it comes to questions of space debris. So I think that's something which we need to be cautious of. The other thing to be cautious of is, and this is a refrain that I've heard and it takes place a lot in the context of developing countries, which is
recording in progress.
Don't worry about putting in place your own satellites and doing your own thing. We have all of the infrastructure. Just access the information and the data via our infrastructure.
Can I add to that a bit, Davis? Let me add to that. I often get asked when I'm traveling, why does India even have a space program, right? And I often get, India bashing is a thing. They sit me down and they tell me that India shouldn't even be spending money on building satellites or launching rockets. And my answer is plain and simple. We are a subcontinent, and having our own satellites is not a luxury. It's a necessity. It's basic. So I think what you're saying is very interesting. And then the geopolitics, the way it works, is there are countries in this world that tried really hard for us to not even have a space program or have an atomic energy program. So I think the bullyism that you see in geopolitics even prevents certain countries from launching or building their own satellites. And that shouldn't, and that's been the case, historically speaking, but go ahead, I didn't mean to interject. But this is exactly what shouldn't happen, right? This is
the point. This is one of the ladders that I was talking about. 20, 30, 40 years from now, much of the wealth of nations will be derived from space activities. And the countries that are building access to space will control that resource. And by saying to emerging countries, you don't need to do this, we will be your gatekeepers to space, reinforces that power dynamic into the future. And I think that is problematic and is something that should be actively fought against. And that decolonization breakdown of the divide has to take place from, us as those nations. It cannot be something that is given to us.
Fabienne, did you want to add anything?
No, I agree completely. I think to put this kind of questions when we are putting 1-2 satellites in the sky in an artistic and very critical way. And when we compare it with Elon Musk, who put thousands of, the plan is that, constellations of satellites. And you go to ask the art to stop it because the well-being of globalism. I think it's a bit forced, this kind of question.
Very, very hypocritical. In fact,
and no, I'm not saying but I just want to say other thing. I think when we talk about art and the culture and research, space research, we are trying to touch all the subjects that is important in the contemporary, and the materiality of the satellites is one of that. So I think we will cross this frontier, let's put it like that, with the research. If the satellites now is bad because it makes a lot of space junk, and it needs to have more research in this aspect, right? And in the aspect of the propulsions, aspect of materiality of satellites, and art and culture is connected with all these discussions of environment and of resources. So we could lead in many ways different research about that.
And a quick note on debris, okay? Space debris. Anything that's orbiting low Earth orbit, whether it's a space station or a piece of aspirin or a leftover stage of rocket, is moving at 28,000 kilometers an hour, which is what makes it very problematic. We have about 330 million man-made debris objects orbiting the Earth right now, and of which about 26,000 are larger than 10 centimeters, just giving you a sense of how much we've cluttered space already. There are only 2 companies that are actually working on technology to declutter. One is a Japanese company called Astroscale. The other is a Swiss company called ClearSpace. And Rob, over to you.
Yes, it's interesting you just mentioned companies, because I noticed at the IAC there was a stand from something called New Space India Limited, NSLIL, and it caused me to think that when we talk about things like space agencies in Africa and the Indian subcontinent, we tend to think of national space agencies and not private. And so I'm interested in this dynamic between the new commercial space agencies, how this would alter this, these ladders that Davis has talked about, and also the way that we see our space in history. So I'd just like you to comment on, these non-state private enterprises. Does that affect the picture?
Davis, I'll let you take this. I can give the Indian perspective, but maybe you can give the African one.
Sure. So I think globally, new space is driven by access to capital. And the people with the most capital are the venture capitalists and the private equity and the billionaires of this world. So it's not surprising that, 3 billionaires have launched their own space companies, and they are from the same countries that have previously established strong, space programs. I mean, Europe in general, not just the UK. So I think that the privatization of space will not fundamentally change things, because if you follow the money is in those same places, and money and power tend to be co-located. There's an interesting, strategy in Africa, which is very different. And I think this, I don't know how more broadly applicable this is to other industrializing or kind of developing countries, but African countries do not have existing large-scale space programs. And so the only way that you can grow a space program in these countries is through small-scale venture capital and startups. So this is finding small startups doing stuff in sort of downstream Earth observation, or kind of like very specific component manufacturing, and building up that industry from scratch, which is a very different approach than you saw, out of a European or a Chinese history, where they had, massive amounts of money flowing from government to build, these really, really large capital intensive programs. So it's a very different strategic pathway to pursue. The other element that I think is really important, and you'd mentioned this earlier, Hollywood is, one of the greatest achievements of American soft power, right?
Absolutely.
Being able to invest into not just building the industry, but building and crafting the stories that inspire people to go into industry is something that is kind of missing. And I think that this is a really big gap that people aren't spending enough time thinking about.
And Rob, just to quickly answer your question, we have about 100 new space companies in India today, of which I would say about 10 are quite mature in the technology levels they've arrived at. There are a couple of rocket companies which are building rockets for launching small satellites. One of them recently 3D printed a rocket engine, which is the first ever in the world. There is a company that is into green propulsion. It is one of 3 companies in the world that's developing green propulsion technologies. We have one of the best single-walled carbon nanotubes manufacturer in the world is in Bangalore, another startup. So these new space companies are doing some really cutting-edge stuff, which the government is focused on the domestic mandate and launching remote sensing satellites and communication. So I think what drives them is very different. And the way new space companies go about creating new technologies, they could be the best allies that the government can have that could feed into the program. They could be anchor customers, but also let the new space landscape create a new kind of space program, not just driven by domestic mandate. And that's happening in a big way now. A question.
I have a question for Fabi. We are about to wrap up this session, but I really would like to ask this question to Fabi, because both Fabi and Davis and you actually, Susmita, said that the Earth oil were very small into this business. And Fabienne, you have developed an art in residence program at IMPE, the research center of a Brazilian space program. And in Europe, we have tried quite a lot to enter the space agencies. There is almost no, the connection between the art world and the private corporation is almost non-existing. So I would like you to just tell us as quickly as you can about your experience. And if it's because IMPE is a research center, it's easier to get into, or...
Hello. I just want to make one little comment about technological safeguards. I wrote in the book of Ewen and the hobby about it, a little bit about it, because India got to develop in this way because the nuclear bombs, right?
Not really.
Because the technological transference is not...
India's atomic energy program started in the early 60s, and the Indian space activities started also somewhere in the early 60s, but completely two different individuals thought of it and ran it parallelly. So it's not true. The first experiment that India demonstrated to get political support for the space program was tele-education, where they televised an educational program around 5,000 villages. So that was the demonstration which got a yes from the Prime Minister's office to go ahead and have a space program. So the focus has really been applications for the last 20 years. Whether it's farmers or fishermen or disaster warning. So I don't think that's true. They run as different programs.
Yeah, maybe
they're not the same program.
Maybe it's good to research a little bit more, because India and Brazil, they started very together in 57, yes. And they were partners. And Brazil had a lot of complication with United States because they cannot use some elements that goes in the rockets. And because
the United States did try similar things.
No, just let me finish. And because that they are not allowed to construct their own rockets, because they need to use some aspects of American technology. And you just can do it when you are like a China, who make a lot of nuclear bombs and put a lot of investment in the exército, and you can give a shit a copy left in the technological safeguard, because if not, we are always ameaçados, always threatened. To be exploded, yeah. So this is one really about China. I'm sure this is about other countries as well. And just for answer you, it's not easy. It's not working the political way of science technology. The artists and scientists is a party, yeah. We go out together when they started to imagine things is wonderful. But politically is really difficult. I don't know how much I will be there or I will get to stay, because it's really, I did like a workshop, plutocracy in Pluto, discussing the idea of plutocracy in the space. And IMPE didn't want to sign it because it was a bit against of the political president right now, and there is a lot of issues in this process, and it's not easy to work inside of a space program.
I think we'll wrap up here, and I just wanted to also respond to your question. Even architects were not very welcome by the engineers who work in these space agencies, which is why it took a small group of architects almost 15 to 20 years to make space architecture a recognized profession in the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. So I think art and artists don't give up. Keep at it. It's not going to be easy. The engineers are not going to let you come in and say, play. But I think I think we should see more of your kind of projects as we move forward. So don't give up, I think. It's very important. Thank you, Davis.